Good afternoon. I am David Garofalo, Director of Marketing and Communications at IANA. Thanks so much for taking the time to learn more about IANA's Intermodal Volume Analyzer this afternoon. Joining us today is Larry Gross, who will walk us through the Volume Analyzer, and he is President and Founder of Gross Transportation Consulting. The goal of today's session is to learn how the Intermodal Volume Analyzer works and why it is an effective tool and resource for your business to have. As background, before we begin the presentation, the data in the Intermodal Volume Analyzer originates from the Equipment Type, Size, and Ownership, or ETSO data report, which has been available for many years. The ETSO raw data is collected monthly from participating railroads and includes a detailed breakdown of monthly traffic activity, including regional volume flows, types of equipment, equipment ownership, and cumulative data by month. Additionally, IANA receives data from participating IMCs for use in other reports that we produce. The Intermodal Volume Analyzer, as Larry will demonstrate, provides an easy-to-navigate interface to provide valuable insights to make better informed business decisions. Larry, I yield the screen to you.
Well, thanks, Dave, and good morning, everybody. Let's see if we can't get our analyzer up there. And yes, you should be able to see it now. I'm very excited by the ability to slice and dice the data using this volume analyzer that I've been working on and helping IANA to put together. And I'm excited to be able to demonstrate it to you today. What I'm going to do is walk through some of the capabilities of the analyzer, using it as a tool to take a look at some of the recent intermodal results, particularly with the focus on June. And so by doing so, perhaps we can get some idea of the power of this new statistical tool. There are two flavors of the analyzer, and I'll show you both in turn. The first one that I'm going to show you is the basic model that includes this year's data, as well as the ability to compare it to the previous years. There's also a more extensive version that I'll get to at the back end of the presentation, which also includes additional years of history and has some additional capabilities. So what you're looking at here is the basic volume analyzer, and what you can see here is a breakout of all of the volume numbers for year to date by month for each of the region pairs that are contained within the IANA data. And just to refresh your memory, here is the map. This is actually part of the analyzer. You can see these tabs down here at the bottom, which we can use to pick up which sheet that we want to be on. And here are the various regions. There are 10 IANA regions in all. And if you look at all of the possible combinations, including intra-regional flows, that's going to give you 53 region pairs for which individual data is being collected. And here you can see on the left-hand side for 2019, all of the region pairs in groups of 5. And then at the bottom, here is the 2019 total year-to-date revenue movements, as well as the 2018 number and the comparison. If we go down a little bit further, you can see the 2018 numbers themselves, the ones that we're using to generate the year-over-year changes. And then stretching off to the right here are the individual monthly reports from January through so far through June. We have the rest of the year laid out. Obviously, those will become filled in as we go further into the year. So for each of these months, we can see the totals for each of these region pairs or corridors, you might call it, as well as the year-over-year change for that month. Then here is the Q1 to date numbers. This is the complete Q1 since we have all 3 months in the hopper, April, May, and June. And then here is the complete Q2 numbers. If we had not yet had the June data, we would be showing here the Q2 through May, the Q2 to date numbers, and you would get the year-over-year change as well. So let's take a look at what this data is telling us in its conclusive form. First of all, year to date, we're down about 2.7% in terms of revenue movements. And you can see that in general, things have been, the gap or the deficit versus prior year has been expanding as we went along. Q1 came in at a 1.5% deficit, whereas Q2 came in at a 3.8% deficit. So the gap is expanding. And especially here in June, where we had a fairly sizable 7.3% deficit versus prior year. But, if we look at the actual raw numbers, it's a little bit of a different story because we did see actually a month-to-month increase from 1.5 million to 1.56 million in May, then a little bit of a retreat in June. So the cautionary note here is that whenever you look at year-over-year changes, you have to be mindful not only of what's happening this year, but what happened last year at this time. And of course, last year we were spooling up into the heart of the ELD-related shortage of drivers, and so intermodal was in an extremely robust environment last year at this time, and that accounts for some of this large year-over-year deficit. Now, what I want to point out here in terms of the power of this is this control panel that we see here, as well as these two important tools, the multi-select tool and the cancel tool. Now, when we talk about intermodal, typically we're talking about two separate markets that are roughly co-equal, what I'll call for shorthand the international market, and the other side is the domestic market. Now, when we use these control boxes here, I can press and select international, and what you'll notice here is that certain changes occurred in terms of the options that are available to you. So what happened with international is now, of course, we're only dealing with containers. We're only dealing with the ISO containers, which are those which are 20, 40, or 45 feet long. And in fact, there's still a few rail-owned ISOs or ISO-sized units out there. So that's why both the private and the rail are still available to us, but the overwhelming majority of the ISO containers are private containers owned by folks other than the rail industry. So when we push international here and the domestic gets grayed out, then what happens is all of these numbers beneath change to just reflect the movement of ISO containers. So here what we can see is that international, during the same time frame that overall intermodal was down 2.7%, here's international coming in with a 0.6% increase year to date. And here we can see all of the numbers on the different lanes. We can see which lanes are more important in terms of the absolute volume. We can see where the heavy hitters are in terms of the individual lanes. We can see the percentage changes. And of course, some of these are extremely large percentage changes. For instance, here's one, 250%, but we're only looking at 14 units, so it's actually insignificant. So when we look at these percentage changes, we also have to look at the volume that's actually moving between those two regions before we decide whether it's significant or not. So if we look at the totals for international, we can see that we started off the year with some pretty strong gains. In January was a 6.5% gain. Then it fell behind in February. It fell behind again in March. So the reason that Q1 still was in the black was purely on the back of the strong performance in January. We started off Q2 again with a good performance in April before slipping behind in May and now further behind in June. And when you put that all together, we were dead even in terms of the international performance in Q2. Now, one interesting thing that we can look at here is let's see what these individual containers are doing, container sizes. So if I select the 20-foot containers, we can see that year-to-date, actually, volume is down on 20-footers by 3.6%. If I pick the 45-footers, which are a much smaller component of the system, we can see that there's consistently a movement away from 45-footers, and volume is down 12.7% year-to-date. Whereas if I look at the 40-footers, well, what do you know? Those are actually a little bit up year-to-date, 2.4%. And only in February and in June did we actually have a deficit in terms of the movement of 40-footers on rail. So this gives you a little bit of an idea of the kinds of things that we can see with this analyzer. Now, in order to return things back to the starting point, I simply hit this cancel tool icon up here, and that brings everything back to the original state. So now let's take a look at the domestic side. And on the domestic side, we have options for containers and trailers. We also have options for a variety of equipment sizes, as well as private and rail. And if we look at the total domestic situation so far, again, down here in 2019 year to date, the loss is 6%. And that's been consistently across all of the months. Every month has been a deficit, with the deficit most significant in the most recent month of June, with a deficit of over 10%. Now, when we talk about domestic, of course, containers and trailers are following a different path. So the first thing we can do is we can use this tool to see what's happening, for instance, with trailers. So if I click on the trailer number, we can see the trailer volume year to date is down by about 10.4%. All of the sizes of equipment are available in the trailer option, because, in fact, all of these lengths of trailers, even 20-footers, are moving on the railroads even yet today. Now, here we can make use of the multi-select tool, which is this little checkbox here. And I'm going to click that. And now you can see that it went from white, which is unselected, to yellow. So what that enables me to do is it enables me to select more than one equipment length and have them all amalgamated. So for instance, we might say that everything less than 53 feet is probably moving LTL or parcel. So I'll deselect the 53-footers, and now I have what I call the short trailer segment of the business. And this is mainly the parcel and LTL carriers that are running this equipment. What's happening there? Well, it's down about 12.3% year to date, and the numbers here in the most recent months are quite significant in terms of deficit. This is a function, I think, primarily of some of the route closures that we've seen for TOFC that have occurred recently, creating this larger deficit. You can also see, using this software, where the lanes are that these trailers are flowing. There are many lanes, particularly in Canada and Mexico, for instance, where there's virtually no trailer volume. So it's also useful for us to be able to see where the action is within the intermodal network in terms of this particular equipment size. Now, if I want to look at an individual size unit, for instance, let's look at the 28-foot pup trailers, which are purely the province of LTL and parcel shipments. And we can see that's down about 12% year to date, and you can see where that volume is flowing. And so, for instance, one of the interesting things is if we look at, for instance, Northeast Midwest, which is one of the more significant lanes for this volume, and here it is right here, you can see that that lane in particular is down by over 23%. So there is, just an indication here that something's happening. Here's Northeast Southeast, a much smaller lane in terms of this type of equipment, about 1/5 the size, volume down 31%. So there have been some changes that have occurred there, and this decline of 12% is not at all evenly spread across all of the region pairs. So this is an indication of the power of this software. And here's the 53-footers, which is the bulk of the trailer activity, 460,000 units year to date, down about 9.7%. And you can see that the deficit has certainly accelerated here in the second quarter. This, I think, is a function both of, I'll say, the loss of opportunistic use of intermodal by truckload carriers that last year were short of drivers, and this year have enough drivers, so they're not putting their trailers up on the flat car. But as well, we do know that there have been some changes in the intermodal network related to PSR type simplification. And so that is one of the other aspects that's driving the volume down recently as well. So if we look at, for instance, at South Central to Southwest, we can see that actually in that case, volume is up a little bit. Volume's up 4%. So just another indication that when we look at the bottom line numbers, that can mask a lot of things that are happening within the intermodal network and within the intermodal sector. And this tool can provide a useful option for trying to dig through some of that. So let's zero everything back out again. And now let's look at the container side of the domestic situation. And here we have only 3 options, either 48s, 53s, or 60s, 60-footers. And yes, There are some 60-foot units running in Canada, and here you can see that in Eastern Canada, Western Canada, there was a grand total of 27 movements, revenue moves of 60-foot domestic containers. Just a new development that they're experimenting with up there, but for the first time now we have the 60-foot option. There are still, if we select 48-footers, there are still some 48-footers out there. Roughly 18,000 revenue moves of 48-foot domestic containers year to date. And you can see that these are centered in some very specific lanes, very specific region pairs, and actually Intra-Northwest is the biggest. Most of these are being used in some form of solid waste transport. So it's actually a very special type of unit, but still being reported into the data. We know that, for instance, this Intra-Northwest movement of 13,000 48-footers, we know that's a solid waste type move. So let's concentrate on the 53s, and here's where the bulk of the domestic container story lies. And domestic container down 5.2% year to date. Really an unusual situation, because domestic container, even going through the Great Recession, we didn't see these kinds of deficits. And those deficits, those year-over-year deficits, have been accelerating as we've gone through the year, with the exception of April was a little bit of a recovery, but we started off in January with a 1.6% deficit versus prior year, and now it's gotten up to a high of 8.8% in June with a Q2 deficit of 6.2%. So these are some fairly significant year-over-year deficits that we're dealing with, but there's more to the story. And here we'll decide to click on private versus rail. So let's take a look at the private domestic container fleet. And interestingly, the year-to-date deficit is only 1.8%, so much smaller than the overall deficit. And you can see we're in the black in January, then slipped slightly into the red, and it's remained fairly slightly in the red up until June. That was a little bit more significant. But if we look at the rail side, well, that's a whole different story. And there, the rail-owned fleets, this is the EMPs and the UMAXs versus the privates, which are people like Hunt and Schneider and Hub Group and Swift and et cetera, that own their own domestic containers and bring them to the rail. Well, here are the rail-owned fleets, and there we see the year-to-date deficit is much more significant. And that has been more or less all the way across the board year-to-date, with a deficit of almost 13% year-to-date, and Q4 at 14% and June at over 18% deficit. So there's definitely something happening here, and we can use this tool to hone in on it a little bit in terms of the specific lanes where perhaps there's a problem. And for instance, if I look at intra-southeast, which is right here, we can see a 19% decline in intra-southeast type movements. Another one of interest that I noticed was Midwest to Mexico. And that rail-owned domestic containers traveling between Midwest and Mexico across the southern border is down 19%. If we change over to the privates and look at that same lane, Midwest to Mexico, volumes up 16% in terms of private domestic containers moving across the border. So I would interpret that there's some sort of a share shift happening there for that extreme difference between the two fleets. And a couple of others we'll look at that are heavy hitters. Here's a big heavy hitter, Midwest Southwest, generally the largest intermodal lane out there. Not in this case though, not in terms of rail-owned containers. Now 106,000 year to date with a deficit of 12.1%. We can compare that to Northeast Midwest, actually more rail-owned containers moving in that lane with a deficit of 9.3%. And finally, we'll look at Northeast Southeast, which is an eastern lane. We're seeing a deficit there of 28%. So that's an area where there's quite a bit of erosion that's happened back to the highway, most likely. Southeast Midwest is another one, and here we're seeing a 23% deficit. These are pretty major lanes for which we're seeing some substantial erosion in volume. So with that, let me return everything back to normal. And now let's take a look at this second sheet that we have here. This is the summary comparison sheet that we've been working with. But let's say we really want to get detail on a particular lane. And by direction, that's where the lane comparison sheet comes in. And so here is the lane comparison workbook, or the lane comparison sheet. And we can see here that all of the origins and all of the destinations, each of the 10 regions that IANA collects the data on. And so right now we're looking at the cumulative total number across the system because all of these different regions are selected. And here are the volumes as well as the year-over-year comparisons beneath. And this is a familiar number, that 2.7%. Year-over-year deficit. This is what we were looking at before on the summary comparison. But now let's say we want to look at a particular lane or a particular region. So the first thing we can do is we can say, for instance, let's say we want to look at only Mexico origination. So here I've selected Mexico, and this is all of the intermodal activity originating within the territory of Mexico, going to all other territories for which traffic has been destined year to date. So roughly 273,000 revenue loads were originated in the Mexico territory to all other destinations. 162,000 of those were ISOs, and 111,000 were domestic containers. Virtually no trailers are being moved out of Mexico. Now, if we want to sort of take a closer look at this, for the one thing, we might be interested in what's moving within Mexico. So by selecting as the destination, whoops, I need to take off the multi-select tool. There we go. By selecting the Mexico destination, now we're seeing only the intra-Mexico volume. And we can see 162,000 ISOs and a much, much, much smaller number of domestic containers moving, both originating and terminating within Mexico. So this is primarily an ISO or international related market. But now we can look at other territories. So what, for instance, what's going from Mexico to the Midwest? Well, the vast majority of the volume that's moving in that instance is domestic containers, 59,000, with just a handful of ISOs crossing the border between or on the way out from Mexico to the Midwest. What about going the other way? So we can say, all right, let's pick the Midwest as the origin and Mexico as the destination, and now we can see a lesser amount, 41,000 total movements. So an overbalance in terms of revenue movements going northward across the border rather than southward. Now, just a point of clarification here, a revenue movement does not necessarily mean that there's freight in the box, because if you have a private container that's moving empty, as long as the railroad is receiving revenue for that box, then it's going to show up in this data. Now, of course, if you have a rail-owned container, domestic container, that's moving empty, there's no revenue associated with it, and therefore it would not show up in this data. So by using the multi-select tool now, we can take a look at groups of areas. So let's go back to the start and then say, for instance, I'm interested in what's happening between, for instance, the Northeast and the West Coast. So I can pick the Northeast here. I can use the multi-select tool here and then just eliminate those which I don't want. I'm going to eliminate all of those, leave the Northwest, leave the Southwest, leave Western Canada, and now you can see all of the transcon westbound movements, 106,000 and change, that are moving out of the Northeast region and into all of the regions on the West Coast. So this is just an example of the kind of power that you have at your disposal with this tool, and you can see a breakout of all of the individual equipment types that are moving between the zones that you selected. And if we want to see the other way, well, then we just have to flip-flop this and pick Northeast as the destination, and we'll do that. We'll have to deselect deselect the multi-select tool, pick the Northeast, select the multi-select tool, eliminate the ones that we don't want, and now we have the other side of the equation, the eastbound, moves off the West Coast, moving into the Northeast. So that is the Intermodal Volume Analyzer. Let's take a moment or two to look at the more expansive version, which is the Volume Analyzer with history. And here you can see that the layout is a little bit different. We've got 4 sheets at our disposal here. It's a more powerful tool because we have the ability to look back at history. We can pick which years to display. Right now I have them all selected. This has volume data going back to 2014. I've got the multi-select tool highlighted here. And if we look on the left-hand side, we have all of our selector boxes. Microsoft calls these slicers. And it's a good name for it, I think, because it means they are the means by which we slice and dice the data. If we look off to the right here, we can see that here's all the data by year. This is 2018, 2017, 2016, 15, all the way back to 14. So all the data is displayed for us here. If I deselect some of these years, then we're going to get only the data that I want, which is through 2017. Anything beyond is grayed out. And then I can also pick the different types, different markets, segment the market using these slicers as we were doing before. Let's look at the international side. Here's the international volume going back to 2017. Now, one of the interesting things that this tool lets us do, I'll return everything to normal here, is the summary comparison now is where we see beneath here, we can compare any 2 years that are within the database. So right now I have it set, it will always pick the first 2 years that I've displayed. So it's comparing, as we did before, 2019 to 2018. But one thing that's an interesting question is, well, what if we look further back? So let's deselect 2018, and now we're going to get a comparison of our current performance in 2019 versus 2017. And it's interesting. If you look at the bottom here, we're actually, even though it's painful right now to see the kind of loss that we're seeing versus prior year, if we look a little bit longer term, we're still up by 3.8% year to date versus the same period in 2017. So this tool can give us a little bit of perspective in terms of the longer term trends that we're seeing in terms of the data. So for instance now, let's say that I want to see, well, what the trend is in international between 2019 and 2017. Well, it looks like it's actually up 6.5%. And I'm looking at this number right here, 6.5% year to date. We can see all of the information, just like before, going all the way across here through the end of the year. And as these additional months come in, these cells here will populate. On the domestic side, go back up and pick domestic. How does that look? Well, we're up just fractionally 1.1% year to date in terms of total domestic. If we look at the trailer side, then actually that's a pretty handsome increase of 4.1%, which tells us that the problem is a little bit more on the domestic container side versus 2017. The rest of this I'll show you just here briefly. This is the lane volume, same kind of comparison that we did before. Here we're able to select individual region pairs or groups of regions and see what's happened and pick any 2 years to compare to see what the year-over-year change is, and also to see what the history of the data is going all the way across, depending on which origins, which destinations that we pick for all the different equipment sizes that are moving. And here is the lane comparison with the year-over-year changes. This is really just the same thing as we saw before, except we're now able to select different years for the comparison. So, Dave, I think that really is at least the initial summary of what this powerful Intermodal Volume Analyzer can do. And now I'll hand it back over to you, and if there are questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Great. Thank you so much, Larry. That was a great demonstration of the volume analyzer. Do we have questions?
Yeah, we've got a few questions here. Got one here about the 53-foot DC downturn. Was that due to the decrease in West Coast transloading? on the west?
I don't think that's really the cause. Based on what I'm seeing on transloading, we're not seeing a huge change in the percentage of volume that's coming off the West Coast that is being transloaded. In fact, because international volume has been holding up a little bit better than domestic, I would say probably transloading has been a little bit of a source of strength for the domestic container side rather than a source of weakness. Of course, with the recent developments on the trade war front, it's anybody's guess as to what that will look like here in the second half of the year, but I'll confine my comments right now to the first half, and I don't think personally that domestic transloading into domestic container was where the problem lays.
I see. Here's a related one, going back to the trailer on flat car numbers and them being down a bit. And I know you don't have a crystal ball, but do you think that that is a result of just returning to that sort of that natural historic decline in that as an offering?
Well, I mean, that's certainly part of it, Hal. We talked a little bit during the presentation about what I termed opportunistic use of TOFC. And that was the folks that didn't have drivers, that don't own domestic containers. They have a load, it's in a trailer, and they needed to get it moved. And so a very simple solution for them was to put it up on the flat car. That volume, I think, was always going to be temporary, and that has returned back to the highway. And so, yeah, a chunk of the decline is simply a return to normalcy. But on top of that, I think there's another layer of decline that's being generated by the changes, or rather the eliminations that the railroads are making to TOFC lanes that are available. And that's basically forcing trailer volume off the railroad. And the question is, does that volume end up going back to the highway, or does it convert to domestic container? And so far, I would say the preliminary evidence is that a lot of that volume is going back to the highway because we're not seeing a corresponding bump in the domestic container movements, even though we're seeing trailer volume go down. And most recently, you look at the last couple of 3 months, the rate of decline on QFC has really accelerated substantially. And I think that increase in the rate of decline is tied into the changes that are occurring in the intermodal network.
Great. Thanks, Larry. I think that is it on the question front. David?
Thank you all very much for your participation today. Just to finish up, the Intermodal Volume Analyzer is available by an annual subscription. And for more information on subscribing to the Volume Analyzer, the Historical Intermodal Volume Analyzer, and the ETSO database, visit intermodal.org or email Tara Mullen at tmullen@intermodal.org. Thanks again and have a great afternoon.